mask. I've got, excellent, thanks. Got kiddos at home with COVID and trying to keep everybody safe here. So welcome if you're joining us online. This is a meeting of the advisory committee of the Maine Offshore Wind Roadmap process. And thanks everybody for being in person. It's fantastic to actually be here in person. Thanks folks who are joining us today. We're really glad to have people here with us. The way this is going to work from a just tech perspective of having this meeting, a hybrid meeting, is we're going to have to use the microphones today, not just so that we can hear each other fine, but so that the folks online can hear us. The cameras here are streaming the webinar online so they can see who's talking, and the microphones allow our voice to be carried online. We've got a bunch of mics today, and we'll make sure we're running those around. I'll say a little bit more about that as we get going in our agenda. But to kick us off today, I wanted to turn this over to your co-chairs, Admiral Gregory Johnson and Dan Burgess from the Governor's Energy Office, to say a few words of welcome. And why don't I turn it over to you, Admiral Johnson, to kick us off.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you everyone for being here. This is, I think, probably the most important meeting we've had for two reasons. One is it's the first time we've met in person. So all these faces we've been looking at on a Zoom screen, they actually exist. They're real people and they're great people. And Terry and Patrice and Ben and the entire fishing industry, thank you for the invite to come here and set this program up. And we had a great time down on the wharf with Terry and Ed and Matt, and this morning trying to educate us a little bit. And I think it was very beneficial, very helpful, and everybody came here with a, an open mind and an open spirit, and it was very, very positive time. I have to say the monk stew was pretty darn good too, and we enjoyed that. And so Commissioner Kelleher, I know you're right here. Thank you for making the trek down to join us today. I've had the privilege of living here in this community for 30 years, but I learned a whole lot more about it in about an hour this morning than I'd ever known about it. And it was a privilege to be asked to serve on this committee. I think it's doing important work. I think we have every possible community of interest represented on our various working groups and on our committees. And we're getting to a critical phase. I thank all of the advisory group committee members who are here today and the working group chairs who are here today. It's almost 100% perfect attendance today. And the time and effort that you put into all the meetings that we have had and to make the trek here today. We are getting towards the critical phase of this whole thing. I like to say we've been doing the jaw part of it, talking, learning, listening to each other, gathering data, gathering information, and now we're getting to the do part of it, where we got to take what we've learned and put together the recommendations. So it's going to, the next 6 months, 8 months, it's going to be a lot of hard work. And it isn't that there hasn't already been a lot of hard work coming at these, at what are called, our initial cut at the recommendations. But as we go together, I think we have a advisory group meeting on the 27th of June. To give a little bit of an update to the advisory committee. And then we have a big meeting on the 20th of July, where we really have to roll up our sleeves and start working hard on the recommendations. So again, thank you, Terry, and everything you did with your folks to put together a very informative session today. And I have to say, as we learn more about the business here and the amount of revenue that I see it go by my driveway in the summer, the trucks coming out of here every morning about 30 full of lobsters. It's a big part of obviously the economy here in Harpswell, but the economy of our entire state is a critical industry, and the community here and the social fabric of that community, we got a very special flavor of it. And thank you, all of you practitioners, fishermen, who are here today and joining with us. We really appreciate it. So I just don't have anything else to say other than to turn it over to my co-chair, Dan. Governor's Energy Office.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. I'm Dan Burgess, Director of the Governor's Energy Office, and can't say it better than you did. So I'll just also extend thanks to everyone involved today and Terry for putting on a great morning. Really, I think I all learned a lot. Grateful to I also want to say the CBI team and the Energy Office team. A lot of logistics and all of that comes with this. And this is the first time we've been able to meet in person. And I don't know about you, but it's been really nice to see people that been talking to on a Zoom screen for a year plus. So looking forward to this being the first of many of these, and the opportunity to continue to learn from one another, hear from one another, and move the work forward. So thank you.
Okay, wonderful. All right. Thanks, folks. And again, it's a relief to be in person. It's frustrating to have the tech work right to be hybrid. So we'll have to roll with it today and hopefully we get it right. I want to walk through our agenda today and what we're trying to do in this meeting. So folks have a sense of what we're trying to do. Let's see if, there we go. It worked. So today is all focused on the issues of fishing, the seafood economy, and related things. That's what this meeting of the advisory committee is about today. And the first thing we're going to do is have a conversation around the Maine's seafood economy and the impacts of fishing on coastal communities. We have two people here to help kick off that conversation. Carla Gunther is here, as well as Don Perkins. So we have some great sort of initial thoughts that we're going to share on that, and then have a conversation about it. The second round of conversation is about digging into the actual fishing effort in the Gulf of Maine, the regulatory effort, and understanding that. Ben Martens kicked us off in March with the conversation and a presentation around that. We're going to pick up where that left off. And we've got two great folks from DMR here to help kick off that conversation about understanding really what the effort looks like out there and what that means. We're going to use in that conversation the experience of the research array and how that got cited, at least in the proposed site, as a way to illustrate the complexity of the layers of information and data and where the data is lacking. So we'll use that as an example just to help talk about this issue. We're going to have a break, a good size break, and a half-hour break. And the idea of that break is to have some informal conversations here of everybody in the room, whether you're here as an observer or you're here as an advisory committee member. We want to use that break as a chance to just talk informally with each other. So that's what that's the intent of having such a long break and towards the end of the meeting, is to really use that as a chance for informal conversation. We want to end this meeting, though, really feeling like we can name some of the key ideas we want to take away, right? So we're going to end the meeting with those takeaways. Okay, great. So this is a meeting of the advisory committee. We're here to have discussion. We're here to talk with each other. I've used this other slide at least once before, and it's about sort of a meeting guidelines piece. The whole point of this conversation is to learn, right? And to learn about people who feel differently than we do about things, and learn from each other on the advisory committee and those who are here, being open to good new ideas, and assuming that we're here in good faith, right? It's a good faith effort to understand differences and learn. Those are my only meeting guidelines. The other more practical ones is if you don't speak without the mic, the recording doesn't get you and the folks online won't get you. So you really do need to speak with the mic. And Laura and I can help make sure we're moving these around quickly, so we're not slowing down the conversation. That's all from me. Laura, am I forgetting anything? Okay. So our first conversation, as I mentioned here on the agenda, is around the seafood economy. And here we've got Don Perkins from GMRI and Carla Gunther here from the Maine Coast. Oh, I'm going to say it wrong.
Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries.
Apologies, Carla. And I have one of those presentations loaded up on the laptop and I don't have the other one. So my sense is, Carla, maybe Don goes first and then I'll be working on your presentation while Is that fine? And did that go into my email just to? Perfect. Okay. Thanks, folks, for your patience. So if that's all right, Dawn, that might not have been your plan, but you're welcome to come up here or you're welcome to stay right where you are. So your choice. You can use any of them. So I can just- Yeah, I'll put those up and here's your clicker.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. While David's grabbing those slides, I'm Don Perkins from the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, and I'm going to go through a very quick series of slides just to try to characterize a flavor of an incredibly dynamic seafood industry up and down the coast of Maine. Terry, thanks to you and this community, we've got a very intimate sense of what's happening here, and I'm going to just try to take it coastwise to give a broader flavor. But I think we all got the message today that this is an incredibly hardworking, dedicated, multi-generational, intimate fishery. And ultimately, from the ocean energy point of view, the question is, how does this process support the fishing community as well as all the other interests at the table? Go right. Go up.
Oh, I see it. Okay, thank you.
You all set?
Yeah, I still let me share it. Right now.
No, you want to just do it manually? Okay, so I'm gonna just kind of try to characterize things. Here's the landings in Maine in 2021, $890 million, 730 million of that is lobsters. Next. There's a lot of small fisheries that matter in these communities. The Scallop Fishery up and down the coast has ranged from small to interesting in bays up and down the coast. Next. Menhaden have seen a resurgence in recent years. At the same time, we've had a terrible reduction in herring, which have been prime sources of lobster bait over time. Next. Ground fish landings have been struggling for 30 years and are down in terms of landings here in Maine to a very small level of landings. Next. But part of what you're going to keep in mind, next, is that there's always more opportunity out there somewhere, and fishermen are always looking for it. They're dealing with reductions in one place and opportunity in another. In 2019, the ground fishing community only was able to harvest about $24 million worth of finfish in the Gulf of Maine. Next. Next. But if they've been able to get to all the quota that was allocated to them, it could have been closer to $300 million. And so there's opportunity out there in the water. And what the fishing community is trying to do is protect that opportunity and have it as an option in the future. Next. The lobster fishery is struggling with an existential challenge on the right whale front. There's the climate change and warming water front. There's ongoing regulations, and now this question of potentially losing bottom to ocean energy developments is yet another existential threat for this community, regardless of what those of us who live on land might see as an opportunity in ocean energy. Next. We got a little flavor this morning that $24 million worth of lobsters comes ashore here in Harpswell, and the total kind of revenue and the economic revenue in town is about 28 million, I think the number was. We don't see this further up in the mainland, but down every peninsula, this is true. Lobster fishing and historically other fisheries have really been the lifeblood of each of these fisheries. Next. And it isn't just the harvesting, there's constant innovation in the supply chain. We've seen a tremendous amount of work in the last 10 or 12 years in terms of developing processing here in Maine for lobsters. Historically, they were going into Canada, and the value was being added there. There's been a huge change in the last 10 years in terms of value being added here. Next. On the aquaculture side, well, we're not hearing from the aquaculture industry. From a fishery point of view, it's important to keep in mind that this is opportunity that has been growing slowly, and the fishing community has been grappling with it. There are leases up and down the coast. Next. Oyster aquaculture we're seeing here in southern Maine. It's obviously concentrated in the Damariscotta River. Like every fishery in the pandemic, it got whacked. And interestingly, very few of these people went out of business. And so these fish farms are resilient in the same way that fishermen are resilient. Next. Innovation has happened here to wrestle with growing oyster spat, with dealing with climate change. Next. On the mussel side, we've seen a slow development of mussel aquaculture, also whacked by the pandemic, but didn't go out of business. Next. And there's constant innovation. And so these are owner operators that are trying to figure out how to grow a business, how to grow an industry. Next. Seaweed, we're all hearing about seaweed because it's in the news, it's being promoted well. The interesting thing about seaweed is it grows between November and May. And so it's an interesting alternative or off-season opportunity for nearshore fishermen who historically have fished in the summer 6 months. Obviously, that's very different from the offshore lobstering community, but seaweed is an interesting kind of slowly growing opportunity here. Next. Scallop aquaculture is in the developmental phase. There are scallops being grown down in Stonington that are now showing up on the market, and there may be a substantial opportunity here over time. Next. Salmon aquaculture is kind of out of sight, out of mind here, but down in Washington County, it's a very substantial presence. And interestingly, there's an industrial form of fishing that has figured out how to make its peace with the fishing community down there, particularly in Jonesport, which is surprising given what we hear about aquaculture. Next. And then we're also seeing the proposals for these onshore recirculating aquaculture businesses that are multi-$100 million investments, huge infrastructure, lots of environmental questions, lots of economic opportunity, but that's starting to happen in certain communities up and down the coast. Next. So what I've just tried to give you a flavor of is an industry that's dynamic, that's hardworking, that never stays the same, and what the fishing community is trying to protect is its options in the future. It seems like every time a change happens, it's a new box being drawn, it's a new line being drawn, they're losing options. And the question, I think, for us is, among the many things we have a charge to do, can we send a clear message about where this process can support the fishing industry and its aspirations, as opposed to ignore, dismiss, or step around. This is, I want to bring it back kind of personal and lead into Carla's presentation. So this is another harbor down on the other side of the Scuda Peninsula. It's called Bunker Harbor. It's a small lobster harbor with about 20 boats in it. Next. And one of the things that I love about going to a harbor is what people are saying on their boats. So we got Last Chance next. We got Resilient next. We got Perseverance. Now, none of us who have office jobs have our kind of soul painted over the door like these boats do. Next. Jerry Ann, next. Teresa Ann, next. Roxanne. So this is personal. This is personal for these communities. You know, what they do for work is tied up intimately with their family. It's multi-generational. It's really unlike what the industrial economy is like. And if we have a hope as a as an advisory committee to try to bridge the gap with the fishing community, we have to put ourselves in their shoes and say, okay, how do we make this something that could be a benefit for them as well? Not an intellectual idea like, isn't addressing climate change good for the fishing industry, but an aspiration, an opportunity idea, an investment idea. Next. So now to come back to my last slide, this is across the top, you see various fishing communities. Along the left, you see the major wild species of lobster, scallops, finfish, aquaculture opportunity, and then down on the bottom, offshore wind. And the point I want to leave you with here is that in terms of immediate benefit, offshore wind may benefit Eastport because it's a port. It'll probably benefit Searsport and the area around Searsport. It may benefit Booth Bay from a jobs point of view. It may benefit Portland. That's not here. So the benefits from offshore wind are going to tend to flow to others besides the fishing community. So we're grappling with the risks that they're facing versus benefits going somewhere else. And we have to figure out how to address that as an advisory committee among our various other charges. Thank you.
Super, thanks. Yeah. Thanks, Don. Okay, so because I need to do a quick little tech swap over here, as Carla comes up, if folks have questions for Don, maybe Laura, if you want to just run the mic for a second, just a quick while I can pull this.
Yep, while you do the magic. All right. Any questions, Suzanne? And if you just grab that mic right next to Don so that everyone can hear you.
Thanks. That was great, Don. I really appreciate that, particularly the perspective at the end. Because so much of the conversation within this group has tried to put Maine in the context of East Coast and sort of broader national development of offshore wind, could you do the same for us in terms of Maine's fisheries and fishing activity? Because I think one of the things that we've come to understand is that it's not just important to each of these individual communities, but it's really, there's a lot of activity here in Maine that is distinct, that is defining and sort of specific to Maine. How is Maine different from other East Coast states that are pursuing offshore wind development?
So among the coastal states, and people in other states would disagree with me, but when I think around the country, Maine's a fishing state, part of Massachusetts is a fishing state, Washington is a fishing state, and Alaska is a fishing state. And there's fishing going on in all the other coastal states, but it's secondary to, in the Gulf of Mexico, to the oil industry. And I think what's so novel here is that, fishing is the primary marine economic engine along this coast. And we have 3,000 miles of coastline. We have proximity to most of the US market. We have proximity to Europe. And so in terms of opportunity going forward, it's just this incredibly precious resource that matters a lot to people here, and it has a lot of value out in the world.
Thanks for that. Any other questions?
Thank you as well, Don. I think your last point that you've left us with, sort of what are the benefits? You were involved back in 2010, and I know there's been a lot of thought. Suzanne was very involved in Monhegan specifically, but when you think about that, you don't have to give us the answer, but what is sort of the range of answers of how could these communities benefit?
So a simple example, we all saw Terry's Wharf this morning. Every harbor along this coast is dependent on one or two of those wharfs that are kind of the heart of the community. It's the security against the real estate market that's pricing everybody off the shore. And so as a simple example, if there was a significant investment made to protect those critical wharfs up and down the coast, when you look at the math of that, against the capital investment for an ocean energy, a commercial ocean energy development. And the kind of, you look at, there was what, $230 million worth of community investments negotiated with the power line in Western Maine. This is actually a bigger, well, it's a comparable industrial development. I think we need to be thinking in terms of what kind of investment would make a difference, would address the fishing industries and communities' aspirations, as well as those of us that are concerned about ocean energy.
Yeah, so just jumping on that though, Dawn, I mean, what about somebody like us who just want to go about our business, right? We don't want the government coming in and sinking a bunch of money into our place because we don't want to have to answer to anybody. We want to run our business like we want to run our business. So that's a good idea for a public wharf, but for a privately owned place like ours, there's got to be a different answer.
I couldn't agree more. And you're right. Hannah asked me a question for an example.
Right.
I think the larger answer, and you've just addressed it, is that were we to say, look, that's a key part of what we want to deliver here, then I would look at you and look at your community here and others along the coast and say, you need to identify what that would look like. What kind of investment in your aspirations would be appropriate and meaningful. That's not for me to answer.
Yeah, Terry, that and Hannah's question, that's a very, very important question. And Dawn mentioned 3,000 miles of coastline. And like, if you count the commercial ports, Portland, Searsport, Eastport, and then you have 4 piers here in Cundy's Harbor, you add up all Stonington, all the way down east. I mean, there's only, I'd say probably less than 50 miles of commercial shoreland out of 3,000 miles. I think a state that's a maritime state can do better than that. And to Terry's point, I do believe power of the state, the power to tax, the power to give tax relief, tax benefits. There's all kinds of ways that this can be addressed that can get to this. And so I think that this will be an important part of how we piece together and our recommendations to recognize this. And I think the state has to do something, or all 3,000 of those miles of the coast, they're going to be, real estate, and none of us will be able to do anything with the sea. So this is a critically important, and I think we've tied up too much of it in these other endeavors, and the state has to take a hard look in the mirror and figure out ways that we can incent the people that have already made the investment and to incent others to do the same exact thing you're doing to keep this heritage alive in the coming years and before it gets past us and we can't turn it back. That's part opinion, part stuff.
I just wanted to draw a connection to some of the other conversations we've had as a group. I appreciate Gio bringing the concepts of equity into these discussions. And just as we've talked about, what does that mean for this work? There's this concept of procedural equity that is at play, I think, to the question of what are the impacts, what are the benefits, and how do we go about addressing these things? I just want to make the connection that what I'm hearing is ask the people who are impacted for what the potential benefit could be. I would say that's sort of like what the practice of equity says. I would say my personal experience of working with an island community with Monhegan for many years to develop a community benefits agreement is that what fundamentally changed that discussion was when the developer offered what they thought the best benefits could be, and the community, and Laura worked very closely with them through this process as well, to say, actually, we would like to define what benefit means to us, and how fundamentally sort of altering that was to the situation to kind of put those folks who are being asked to live amongst this, work amongst this, have the opportunity to say what's meaningful to them. And if we're talking about how does this development support other aspects of Maine's economic development and livelihoods, then I think that's a really, I wanted to underscore the importance of asking people what the potential for benefit could look like. And I think in this industry in particular, we've seen, lots of stories of resilience, ability to adapt, the entrepreneurial thinking. And I think it's actually really exciting to think about what sort of collaboration between these industries could look like in terms of the additional potential that could possibly be unlocked as part of this process.
Great, thanks for that. Any other questions? David, I'm looking at you now to give a sense of where we might be.
So Laura, can
Yeah.
I just, I just to put a sharp point on this, this process basically in terms of asking the fishing community to be involved has been basically inviting a community that's in essence being asked to take, they're being asked to take nothing but risk for no benefit. And we have to figure out how to address that. We just have to figure out how to address that. If we want the fishing community to be supporting this kind of endeavor.
Come on, I know you gotta say it.
I'm sorry, but I mean, we can recommend anything we want. What the risk is for us is when it goes to DC and BOEM actually grabs a hold of it
Absolutely.
and they go off on whatever they do down there. Nobody knows where that rabbit hole leads, right? They don't know that just because we recommend it and our state recommends it, doesn't mean the BOEM is going to take that recommendation. They may say, thank you very much for your hard work. See you later.
Terry, I think we're all terribly aware of that, and that process is moving fast. And but the question we have is, we can either let the process move fast, fractured, or we can try to have an impact on that process with other than being fractured as a state.
I agree. I mean, we should be doing this, but we do have our butts hanging out there,
No question.
even after the recommendation
No
comes out.
question.
Because what we come out with doesn't mean anything here, as far as the federal process goes.
No, very, very good point of multiple layers of offshore wind. So there's the state roadmap process, which is what this is. But then there's the BOEM process, which is really where the federal leasing process happens for offshore wind sites. And I don't know if it was mentioned yet, but last Thursday, there was a restart of that process, an all-day meeting, which began to discuss how do we go from a large Gulf of Maine and winnow down to actually come up with sites to lease offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine. And that is a process that's moving forward rather quickly and will impact everyone. So the more we can inform that process as a state and collectively, the better. Grant, do you have something you wanted to add? And then I think we'll pass it to Carla.
I just want to say how important it is for everybody to work together right now to make the best recommendations that we can. The Gulf of Maine, we like to take ownership of it. We do a lot of, I mean, you guys do a lot of work on the water. If we don't watch out, somebody from another state is going to take ownership and they're going to do what they want to do. So respectively saying, let's try to work and come up with the best solution for everybody that can be presented. The fishing community needs to be respected, basically, is what I'm saying. But it would be nice if we kept in mind the Mainers that also live inland that have a lot to gain, if we can get them into unions and get them good paying jobs and start a different type of economy for them, because they haven't always been able to go to the water for their income. And there's a lot of struggling communities just back a few miles.
Point. We're a large, diverse state. So we're going to hear from Carla Gunther, who's the chief scientist at the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries. And Carla's going to give us a little bit more of our perspective from the Down East. So we spent a lot of time, obviously, here in Cundy's Harbor, but as Don pointed out, it's a large coast, it's diverse. And we asked Carla, and thank you, I think you get the gold star for traveling the farthest to get here today. really appreciate you giving your perspective. And I'll let you give more about your background because your perspective comes from many places, not just your title as chief scientist here. So Carla?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, David. Thank you, Council, for the invitation to speak here today. Yes, I am the chief scientist at a small nonprofit located in Stonington, Maine. Living in Stonington, I generally get the Gold Star Award for traveling the farthest. I know, yeah, that's true. You are further down the road. Yes. Oh, Dawn, you are a poor model. Okay, gotcha. Where do you want me? Right here? Okay. All right, thank you. So this is a view of Stonington's harbor, and we have roughly 300 licensed lobstermen fishing out of Stonington, about 100 of them fishing year round. And I guess we can go to the next slide, please. I was invited here today to talk about Maine's coastal communities and their connections to fisheries. They can be considered by this group's work. And here's a picture of our building. We're on Stonington's working waterfront, and we are now, I think, 10 years in the running of being Maine's largest lobster port. As the signs were replaced, welcome to Stonington, we had to badge ourselves very proudly as being Maine's lobster port just a few years ago. So I wanted to just give you a little bit of background. As Laura was saying, I am the chief scientist. I'm an interdisciplinary scientist. I've been studying human organization and fisheries around the world, mostly small scale fisheries. And I also study the environment that those fisheries occur in. So I'm also an oceanographer, an ecologist, and a social scientist. I'm also married to a fisherman in Stonington. And I have 2 children that are, one of them's a kindergartner and already in the school system there in Deer Isle. I'm trying to think of anything else I should tell you about. But anyway, go next slide, please. So in this question of fishing communities and their connection to fisheries, they're kind of 2, I don't know if you want to call them gold standards, but standards that we use in order to measure those connections. One is here from the DMR's landing dashboard, which is a great tool. It's new and everybody should use it. So this is a summary of the past, I don't know, from 2008 to 2021, total landings. This isn't just lobster, but this is all value fishery landings. And that bright red dot is Stonington. That's over $700 to $800 million in fishery revenues there in Stonington. The amber dot next to it is Vinyl Haven. So these are the 2 places where fishing really has brought in an inordinate amount of money in the past decade. So I also want to call attention, though, however, to the other lighter yellow dots and all of the other white or smaller dots. And this goes to Don's point of how spread out and diffuse fishing connectivity and fishing dependence is. It's not like you can target a place where it really matters and say, this is where we need to focus our solutions. It's, we have to understand really all those different connections. Next slide, please. So then I go to the other kind of tool that we have available to us more readily. And this is put out by the feds. It's NOAA's social indicators. Unfortunately, it's not as real time as we would love. These indicators are from 2018. And red dots indicate a high commercial fishing reliance. And that just means that the amount of population of a town related to the amount of fishing participation or federal permits that are held in an area. So you can see these the islands and the outer edges of a lot of the peninsulas in Maine register as being very highly fishing reliant. We still have a lot of orange as soon as you get into those harbors, and green. Again, green is, it's low, but then there's yellow. That's also, we're connected still. We're heavily fishing reliant across the entire coast. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we've observed, Stonington, this is the Stonington lobster boat races. Again, we're in the middle of the state, so we get to kind of be the heart of racing in the mid-season. And if those of you didn't know, that's already part of the cultural connection to lobstering and to fishing. Everyone has their boat, and their boat isn't just the place where they work. It's also so much a part of going on picnics and family time together. It's what we do. It's our lifestyle. So as Don was saying, they wear their spirit or their soul on their badge. I certainly hope my husband isn't, because his boat's name is the Tyrant. But it's that was named that before he married me. So I also say I wanted to call this out. This is 2013's lobster boat races in Stonington. There's a giant raft of, I don't know, 10 boats or so. And what we've seen in the past decade is this shifting seascape from these versatile boats that are around 30 feet, maybe 40 feet. And they fished for scallops in the winter. They did shrimping maybe in the winter. They fished for lobster in the summer. Maybe some urchining mixed in there as well. And instead, we see this shift to single species specialization to bigger and faster boats. So Nick Lemieux's boat, the Phantom, right there is the last one. And I remember he was like one of the first of the 50-foot lobster boats that came out. He and his dad finished this boat off. This was its kind of coming out, if you will. And my husband's boat is the one right next to it. And we were paled in comparison. Just look at the houses and the rooftops of those two cabins. I mean, we got hitched up actually when one of the waves came by because it was just such a different thing. And now you go to Commercial Fisheries News and there's a 50-footer being cut out every other month, basically. So we're really looking at these specialized, bigger, faster boats. That's a lot of investment. So it's a different kind of capital investment. Fishermen, even just 2 decades ago, usually didn't go to the bank for loans. They waited and they saved up and they made money from the smaller boat and built up and built up. Now you're looking at loans and they're sizable loans in order to be able to invest to participate. Next slide, please. Because of that shift, this dependence and this higher investment into the lobster fishery, and again, this is coast-wide, this isn't just down east, we launched a collaborative project with the federal Sea Grant funds, working with Patrice at MLA, UMaine, us at MCCF and DMR to develop these specifically lobster coastal community indicators of social resilience. DMR already has these great biological surveys where they're monitoring the lobster population at the different life stages. So biologically, we can get a finger on the pulse of how the resource is doing. What we don't have until we're starting to develop this now is a social indicator that we can monitor through time and find out how coastal communities are doing, how fishermen are doing with their relationship and maybe vulnerability and sources of resilience. This is only about a year into the project. Next slide, please. But we kicked it off last summer. The postdoc and I, we did about 38 interviews, and we're breaking the coast up because we do recognize that regionally there are very different factors at play determining vulnerability and resilience in lobstering in their communities. So the way to read this is that the purple bars are the South Coast populations or communities, red bars are the mid coast, and yellow bars down east. And what you see is to the west in the South Coast are those big purple bars. That's showing that with these statements on the bottom about community well-being, there isn't a whole lot of agreement. So the way to interpret that is if the lobster fishery in my community is important to our social and cultural identity, or the lobster fishery is an important economic driver, or most people in my community are connected to the lobster fishery, or the overall status of my community is an indicator of how the lobster fishery is doing. You see on the farthest right, the 2 black lines are showing that mid-coast and down east, everyone, fishermen, community leaders, as well as like the dockside harvesters and fishing stores and things like that, the bank, they answered and strongly agree, yes, indeed, my community's status is an indicator of how the lobster fishery is doing. They're that inextricably linked. We can't have community well-being without well-being in the lobster fishery. And that's kind of the way to read those. If the bars are really close to the top, that means there was strong agreement that there's connection between the lobster fishery and their community. Next, please. Okay. His question is, where's the geographic line? I don't know if Patrice, you can remember off the top of your head, but we'll say down east pretty much is Stonington east. Then mid coast is say Rockland, Knox County, all the way over to probably like Damariscotta, I think, to about here. Yeah. Does that sound right? Yeah. Yeah. So here's some early data from the work. Doesn't project very well, but we're trying to understand how to define a fishing town to kind of look at some of these different relationships. So on the left, you see towns where at least 10% of the population held a state commercial lobster license in the years 2016 through 2019. So you could see a concentration again around Stonington, Vinyl Haven, that area. You can see the towns to the east where at least 10% of the population is working with the fishery. On the right are the top 25 towns where the majority of lobster licenses are aggregated. And you can see also that, again, this is so diffuse to look at all of this, that there isn't one place you can target and say, this is where we need to help, or this is where we need to have an impact. Next slide, please. So keep an eye out for the rest of that project. We're really looking forward to it. A lot of people are eager to find out what we learn as we go along. The EM3 objective is this other project that we kicked off in partnership with DMR and NOAA Fisheries about 5 years ago. We're focused on the Eastern Maine coastal current, where the gray highlighted area is here. And we're developing a research framework that supports kind of ecosystem-based management decisions. One of the things that's unique to this, as opposed to other ecosystem-based management things you've heard about in fisheries, is that we're also connecting the watersheds, the fresh watersheds, to basically out to the Area 1 line. Next slide, please. In kicking this off right before the pandemic, we broke it up into 5 different watershed areas, and we engaged directly with communities, not just fishermen, but of course in these areas, everyone is pretty much connected to fishing one way or another. And we asked them to identify long-term vision and values for ecosystem-based, at that point, fishery management. What do you want to get out of this? And we also asked them to give us, specific changes, climate changes they'd seen or observed. Next. In the Narraguagus watershed, we heard people talk about computer technology, broadband infrastructure. We want to make sure we have education opportunities for our youth. We heard about retention and job opportunity, diversification of fisheries. That's the first time, like one object or one goal around fisheries. They wanted all of these things for their communities, and that's how connected fishery management is to their community viability, that they couldn't even talk about fishery management objectives without thinking about these things. They also wanted to be proactive and not reactive. Okay, next slide, please. And then we got together, we met in Trenton with folks from the Union River watershed, and ask the same questions. Coastal resilience, they're talking about kind of ecosystem, coastal, this is more like sea level rise kind of concepts of coastal resilience. They want to collect data to fill in our knowledge gaps of how the system works in that area. Also social and economic knowledge gaps. They wanted to work on volume versus value, or value really, is they wanted to focus on increasing our value instead of just looking at bringing pounds and pounds over the dock. They wanted common sense, hope, action. They also talked about schools. They talked about opportunities, housing values, gentrification, things like that. So again, here we are in an ecosystem-based management meeting, and we're having social rules, social values put forward because again, they're so inextricably linked. Okay, next slide, next slide. Here's something that comes out of the Northeast Fisheries Science Center every year now. They're starting to do these state of the ecosystem reports. They don't change too much one year after the next, but on our EM3C team is one of the women who works on this publication. And in working with us in EM3C, she started putting these social indicators together in that report. And they're looking at social vulnerability in the top commercial fishing communities. And what I want you to know is, how many of them are in Maine, first of all, and second of all, that the 3 blue, medium high to high vulnerability in fishing communities, Cranberry Isles, Boston, Mass, and New Bedford, Mass. What's driving the Cranberry Isles high vulnerability is the level of poverty. They go over the line of a threshold for poverty, but look at the cluster of all these other Maine communities. And it's because of the commercial reliance. Their commercial reliance is what's driving their vulnerability, or their approximation to being a really highly vulnerable. And that's because there is a lot of social discord and there is a lot of poverty in Eastern Maine. It's a place where fishing matters. It's one of the reasons why we're focusing on that for the Eastern Maine Coastal Current Collaborative. Next slide, please. So to get at that, this is ugly. It's a pretty, and it's in progress. Carl and I and others have been working on this network map. Somewhere here to the bottom left is an orange box that says commercial fishing. And we got a bunch of people together from Eastern Maine, people who worked in the medical centers, people who worked at the school boards, all folks like that, town managers. And we started to map the connectivity to commercial fishing, just so we could understand how deep it goes. And all these lines start to go out. But what's interesting now is this is an unfinished product, but schools, everybody talks about how if we don't have money coming over the docks, if we don't have a haul coming over the docks, we lose our school. We lose the amount of kids sitting in chairs. We lose the amount of teachers who can come. We lose the dollars to be able to support having a school at all. If we don't have lobster or some other product coming over the docks, we don't have medical centers. We lose that kind of gravitational pull to have these kind of basic supplies and societal support. So that's the other thing I want to talk about. When we think about the connectivity, it is so much deeper than cultural identity. It's just about the actual functioning of society. You need to have medicine and you need to have schools in order to have a town identity and to work. So this is again another project that's sort of kind of moving along fairly slowly, but we're looking at getting back together with folks and mapping these networks. I'll end it there. Again, thank you for your time. The next slide.
Thank you, Carla. Really appreciate that. And we have some time for a couple questions for Carla before we transition our tech. Who's got questions or thoughts from what you heard that Carla presented? How does that resonate with you? It was so, I mean, everybody understands this? Greg, let me give you the mic.
No, that was Carla, that was excellent. And one of my pet rocks is, I call it social fabric. I grew up in a tiny little town in a rustic, long way from the water, but the social fabric of our communities, rural communities, is getting thinner and thinner and thinner. And so I think this is profoundly important. Your point about schools and medical, I do another kind of fishing a lot up in Greenville. I go, in fact, I'm leaving tonight to go fishing for the next 2 days, but Greenville, they're focused on keeping their high school open and keeping their little hospital open, and they have social fabric problems too. And so I'm delighted that you're looking into this. This is profoundly important. I just read a book this summer too about Narraguagus High School. What was the name of that book? Anyways, 5 students there, and it got into a lot of this stuff. And I'd recommend the book to anybody, but I'm delighted to know that this is going on, and it's certainly something that we need to consider and factor into our recommendations as we go along. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. The question was, can everyone just introduce yourselves when you speak? Greg, I know you already did. And now we have.
Yeah, this is Tom Welch. I appreciate your presentation, and I'm so struck by this diagram, spider web you have up there, but there's another element to this that you might have some information about, or maybe you could develop some. And that is, to what extent are the fishing communities net importers or exporters of money? In other words, there's a real problem. We get up to Washington County. It's huge level of dependence. There's actually an international statistic on this sort of thing, where a vast amount of the proportion, the amount of money that has to come in from social services, state taxes, things of that nature, is much bigger than what's actually produced there. My sense is, from what you're describing, is that in at least some of the fishing communities, that doesn't hold true. But if you lose some of the fishing resources, that would become true. And it'd be very interesting to see what those numbers would be, because I think that would help inform decisions about where state resources ought to be put in order to either preserve, enhance, or avoid some of the negative implications.
Yeah, you touched on a very big point that came up in our first meeting, making that diagram. Tora Johnson at UMaine Machias has been working with a lot of clammers and with the Sunrise County Economic Development Council. I think there's going to be work coming out from them on this, but exactly the kind of government funding coming into Washington County and what portion of the population, what percentage of that money, is used to support what part of the population. And it's primarily clammers, I think, is what she had learned. But I think those are all really great points to be thinking about. And it means that there are avenues or channels that we can be thinking about balancing impacts of, or something along those lines. I don't know yet. Thank you for that point, though.
Hey, Carla, I'm Will Sedlak from Maine Conservation Voters, and thank you for the presentation. I guess two kind of threads of thought. The first is, I had the benefit of, my father was in the Navy, so I got to move all around the country, but then I mostly grew up in South Central Pennsylvania, in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. And thinking about that graph and the reliance on single industries has me worried. And I guess to the extent that, Stonington is doing really well right now and has done really well in the past, looking to history, how much of Stonington's past was informed by both being a fishing port and all of the amazing quarry work that was done there? How much of that, the building out of the ports there was I guess, multi-industry reliant as opposed to just fishing? And what story can we tell about kind of expanding broadband and making sure that when the fishing is great, that's great, but the schools aren't closing when we have a bad year? And I guess, how are we thinking through that?
Oh, that's a good question. When we get a lot in Stonington, and I have an interest, I don't know, I think kind of differently about this a little bit, because Stonington's a pretty unique place, and also its geography, it's just really out there. We feel like we're at the end of the road or the end of the earth here, but we're really out there. But yet there's a lot of brain trust in Stonington, and we've got a wonderful town manager, unlike Deer Isle, who we don't have town structure in management. So you can just see kind of like how disparate that island will react to all of this. Okay, it'll be very, very different. And I think there are other communities that don't have a relationship with a Stonington that we almost have to think more about. And I don't want to say that because I want Stonington to have some good attention. I want our island to have some good attention, but we're not the ones you need to be thinking about.
All right, we have a last question. And Ben, I'm going to give you the mic.
Thank you, Ben Martens with the Maine Coast Fishermen's Association. So Carla, I have one just quick response to that, and then a question for you about your data stream. But I would also just say, like, Will, I don't know that we would ask that question about a community that's dependent on farming, right? Like, we would say, like, we are going to invest in that infrastructure, and we would be trying to make sure that we are managing the natural resources and the food production side of the equation so that it is there, even if it's relying on one piece of that industry. So I think that we need to remember this is part of our food system as well that we're talking about. And then for the data stream, when you were going through and looking at the ports, and you're trying to judge the impact or the importance of a port based upon, is it home ports that folks are living in? Because there's
which graph?
So you had the dots of importance of these different ports when you were.
But which one?
Yeah, I know.
Was it the federal, the state, or which
so
one?
It doesn't matter, all of them, because like what we've seen over the past 5 years as there's been an influx of cash into our coastal communities is that a lot of people who had traditionally lived in those communities and that were part of the fishing community have had to leave and move inland. And so we started to see a diffusion of that perceived impact for a coastal community because we've seen folks have to move inshore. And so you don't see the pop of some places. And we're in Harpswell right now. It's a hub for places like Brunswick and Bodenham and these other rural communities where people come here. So how do you take that type of data stream and the changes that we're dramatically going through right now to start thinking about like hubs of communities?
Yeah, that's one that just on Monday in our social indicators meeting we've been talking about. That's why we're playing with the data in those two different ways, like aggregates of lobster licenses versus percent of the total population. And when do we start doing that? Because I think one of those graphs, you can see Stonington and Deer Isle. Stonington does not come up. Depending on how you look at it, Stonington does not come up as an important lobster place. That's pretty hard to believe. Deer Isle does though. Deer Isle lights up. Brooklyn, Sedgwick, all of the rest of the peninsula lights up as being really important places, but their town managers aren't thinking about how to support the fishery. They're not thinking at all about what any of these impacts will mean to their towns. So we need to be thinking about this port shed. And that's kind of how we're playing with the data right now, is so we know when we're bringing in all of those other data sets for creating a vulnerability index, or, that we know what the right scale and what places to identify how they light up. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Super. Thanks, Carla. Thanks again for Carla coming down. Really appreciate that. You can just drop the mic right there. Okay, so we're going to roll right into our next presentation here. You can see the names up on the slide here. We've got Deirdre Gilbert and Carl Wilson, both from DMR. Many of you might already know them. If you don't, Deirdre is Director of the State Marine Policy. Carl is the Director of the Bureau of Marine Science. So they're going to walk us through, again, some information that may sound familiar from the presentation that Ben did a couple months ago, and go a little deeper. And so I'll turn it over to you, and let's see if this works. Oh my gosh, it's a miracle. All right, so, well, I spoke too quickly. There we go. If you want to use, you can run your own slides if you want to. And
No, I think I can, is it just this area?
yep, you might need to point it.
Okay.
Stand over here.
Okay, why don't you do the slides and then I'll do it for you. Okay. But he said you have to point it that way. And go ahead and go to that slide, next slide, Carl. Okay. Oh. Okay, all right, I think we're ready. Okay, so the outline of Carl and I's talk today, I'm kind of covering the first 4 bullets. So we just wanted to give you some further information about Maine's fisheries in the larger context. And you've heard kind of little bits and pieces about that today, but I think we have a little bit more to offer. And then some comments on just the culture of fisheries management, both in Maine and kind of extending up to the federal level, the current constraints that the fisheries are operating under, and then the long list of developing stressors that our fisheries are facing. And then when I finish those points, I'll hand it over to Carl to talk about the siting of the research array and our experience with that. So first slide, Carl. Okay. All right. So this is kind of a lot of data, but that first bullet kind of comes from our federal partners telling us that for federal commercial fishing operations, and this is non-lobster trips in the Gulf of Maine, the average annual landings are about 130 million pounds, and that's worth just under $100 million. And there are an average of 42,000 trips per year by 929 different vessels, and those are vessels from North Carolina up to Maine. Kind of at the next level, both state and federal commercial fishing operations by Maine fishermen in 2021, that was nearly 400,000 trips. So just to try to kind of, again, give another metric to think about the scope and scale of fishing in Maine, about 2/3 of those 400,000 trips are lobster trips, according to our landings program staff. And another little kind of factoid is that of all the reports, fishing reports that come into kind of for the East Coast, all of the fishing activity, about 1/3 of those reports come from Maine fishermen. So just an enormous amount of activity, enormous amount of scale and scope with regard to Maine fisheries. You've already heard today that in 2021, our landed value for all the fisheries was $890 million. That was a new record. In my time at the department, we always used to kind of be, fishing is about $1 billion worth of economic activity in Maine. But when we use that number, we were also thinking about some of the ancillary, activities that follow the actual landed value of the fish. This is just the landed value of all of the seafood products. So when you factor in that additional economic activity, it's at least twice that.
2021 was up from 2020, $350 million, which is an unbelievable amount. But even over our prior record, we were up $150 million. And again, as you've heard, lobster is more than 80% of that figure, $730 million last year. And just when I think about that number, what I think about is the fact that, an individual fisherman might be able to think about ways to diversify their activity, but that amount of value cannot be made up in any other way. That is an enormous amount of money that just doesn't exist in other fisheries other than lobster. So next slide, Carl. I'll just cover this really quickly because Carla already kind of ably spoke to this data. That first graph, that shows engagement by fishing communities. The second one, I think, is the one that Carla had on her slide, which is actually the social and economic indicators of reliance. And that's where you really see those red and orange and yellow dots pop along the Maine coast, much more so than in other New England states. And then she had the slide about the vessels, and I was going to make the very same point, which is that if you can see it, that smaller green vessel in that slide was kind of what was a typical dragger for a long time, a boat that was participating in ground fish, shrimp, and whiting throughout the year. But historically, a lobster boat might have been smaller than that dragger, and now we've seen a pattern where the lobster boat's getting larger and larger, capable of fishing offshore as they need to do these days. And we have built a fleet that is really kind of capitalized for the fishery that we have today. And that would be, it would be impossible, I think, for that kind of fleet to adapt to a much smaller fishery. So that's kind of the same point I think that Carla was making. Next slide. So with regard to kind of how fisheries are managed, particularly in Maine, you might have heard Maine really prides itself on a model of co-management, and that is pervasive through kind of all the different levels of governance from the municipal level up to some degree to the federal level. I'm going to speak mainly about the kind of state level co-management activities. Co-management, I would say, it doesn't have a commonly accepted definition when you ask people what it means to them. I think people have kind of different ideas along a continuum about where the authority for management decisions lies, but at the most fundamental, to me, it represents a commitment to a shared decision-making process between the managers and the industry. And from our perspective, this is unique in regulated industries. The fishing industry has involvement kind of all throughout these conversations. They're not just given an opportunity to provide comment at a public hearing. They've been part of the conversations kind of leading up to that moment all along. So in the case of the lobster industry, you're probably aware we have these 7 lobster management zones, and Terry had pointed out this morning that this particular harbor lies on a zone line on the EF line, so that represents a unique kind of challenge for fishermen from this area. But the state and the fishermen have invested a tremendous amount of energy and effort in this system starting in the mid-1990s, and we have in each of those zones, we have a council of lobstermen. Each zone is broken down into districts. So each district elects a lobsterman to represent them at the zone council level. The department goes through an election process every year to find folks to serve on these councils. As we said, Matt is now a member of the Zone F Council. And that whole kind of system, I think, invests or empowers fishermen to have a voice in a lot of at least what goes on kind of through the Department of Marine Resources, laws and regulations. There's a lot of conversation there. The final point about this slide is that Maine really focuses on fishing as a primary activity, that we want to make sure that other activities that are coming in, the standard is typically no unreasonable impact on fishing or marine resources. Next slide, Carl. So this, again, this is information I think that's been shared with you in prior meetings. I think this is some of the material that Ben spoke to you about, but
although there may be a perception that, you know, the Gulf of Maine is a big blank slate and we're just looking for a little area to do something, there is already a lot of carving up that has already occurred for different purposes and different reasons. And the people who use the Gulf of Maine are already constrained in any number of ways. You heard this morning about the LMA1 restricted area, which I don't have anything to point with, but it's that kind of rectangle that runs, thanks, along the Area 1-3 line. So when someone gets displaced from that area, obviously they're impacted, but that's not where it ends. Like, they have to go somewhere, they have to fish somewhere else. Other people are impacted by that as well. So it's kind of a ongoing effect. But I think you understand this point that there is already a lot of constraints on people. And I guess the final point about this is that this took a long time to develop and craft and negotiate and for people to agree to. And the benefits that are expected to flow from that, I think people would have a concern, or fishermen would have a concern, that when you change things, like, are we losing the benefit that we got from the sacrifice that we already made? So that's another factor in how people think about this space. This is just kind of I guess what's called a heat map to show you the fishing activity that we get. This is just from vessel monitoring systems, and it represents activity from 2011 through 2016. And you can see those areas from the prior slide start to pop out as like weird rectangles where, you know, we don't see that. And that's because of those other layers of management. What you also don't see here is the fact, and I think you're aware, that the lobster industry has not been subject to VMS. So we don't have that same data for that activity, but that would obviously show up very clearly along the coast of Maine if that had been the case over those years. And this is my final slide, just trying to put this conversation in the context of everything else that the lobster industry and other industries are being asked to think about and participate in. So you heard again this morning a lot about the management measures that are being implemented to protect North Atlantic right whales. We're just implementing, effective May 1 was the first round of management measures, and there are expected to be at least 2 more. And it's not just that the industry knows, okay, there's more rounds of risk reduction that we're going to be subject to. Those rounds are to achieve a 98% risk reduction. If anybody has heard the commissioner speak on this, basically what he has said is, like, we would have to reinvent the fishery to achieve that level of risk reduction. There's no way that it's going to look like it does today and make that goal. And again, if that's all people had to contend with, if everybody just thought, okay, we have a problem to solve and we have to figure out how to do that, but there's another layer where a lot of this stuff is still being, you know, argued out in the courts. And so there are lawsuits that are going to potentially further impact what we currently understand that we need to do. And that is a very unsettling place for people to be, to know that their kind of livelihood rests in the hands of a judge in DC. So a lot of focus and energy on that. Then there's the other competing uses that they're already contending with, and aquaculture is expanding in Maine, and that's good and for a lot of reasons, and that provides an opportunity for diversity. It also provides areas of conflict along the coast, and particularly when there's large scale lease proposals being considered. And that's stressful for folks, and it requires their engagement in those processes, because that's how we find out that there's a problem. People need to come forward and tell us that that would impact their activity. Everybody's expenses are going up. The costs of complying with the North Atlantic right whale measures. It's not just, you know, buying the materials you need to comply. It's your time. It's the opportunity cost of not fishing. It's hiring more crew members. It's a kind of an endless list of costs that go along with that. Bait is getting obviously a lot more expensive as it becomes a little bit more scarce. Again, it's not even kind of the expense of the bait. It's, you know, can I even get it? It's something I need to do my job. Is it going to be available? Cost of fuel, I know everybody is experiencing that. Ice and berthing and other fisheries. There's a conversation right now about the health of the lobster resource. That's happening at the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. And there's a question about whether there are additional management measures that need to be considered to keep the fishery at its current high level of abundance. We just held a series of zone council meetings to talk about the scientific basis for that thought process, and are asking the industry to, think about that and what that might mean. There's obviously interplay between, do we need to do something further to protect the lobster resource, and what might we be doing to protect right whales? Are we going to get a benefit of what we do for right whales on the lobster resource? It's kind of like a chess game. Like, what do we commit to? What do we get out of those decisions? So it's, again, nothing is easy or clear. Working waterfront access. Not every community has someone thinking 30 years ago about buying wharfs and setting up models where you're going to only walk away with what you put in, and the next generation is going to get that access at an affordable rate. That's something that people worry about. And then finally, the new vessel monitoring and reporting requirements in multiple fisheries, both trackers and reporting and other forms of monitoring. It's just another thing for the industry to contend with. So this is not by any means supposed to be a comprehensive list of what I think keeps people up at night. It's kind of what keeps me up at night sometimes. So the only kind of thing I would say is that they're also all interrelated, and decisions in one impact what we do in others. And these are all things that are demanding the industry's attention and engagement, and everybody is spread really thin. So it's hard to kind of get people's focused attention on any one thing when they have 10 different things to be worried about. So that is the point at which I hand it off to Carl.
Great.
You'll do it?
Yeah, I'll try to do it all. We'll give it a shot. Okay. Offshore wind seems like it's consumed my life for the last 2 years, and I realized this is the first time I've actually talked about offshore wind in front of people in person. So such are the days we live in. Okay, so my name's Carl Wilson. I work for the Department of Marine Resources, have for the last 23 years or so. For the first 16, I was the lead lobster biologist for the state, conducting research and monitoring programs up and down the coast. And the last 7 years, I've been directing our Bureau of Marine Science. From someone who has been thrown into these conversations from relatively zero, I would just, from a science perspective and from a department's perspective, I'd just like to express that there are some legitimate questions and concerns about the ecosystem impacts, the social impacts, and ultimately some of the economic impacts that offshore wind might bring about on our waters. And I'll start with the science perspective in that when you bring in structures into an environment that was relatively absent of structure other than what has been there already, you're bringing into a disturbance into the system. And we legitimately do not know what those impacts would be, whether they be the physical turbines, changing the wind patterns, which may change some of the stratification in the water column, which may impact some of the bottom deposition rates on the actual bottom, which may impact some of the animals traversing through the transmission cables on the bottom. So there's some legitimate concerns if our scientific surveys are kind of pushed out of areas because we can't safely operate around a wind farm. Our partners in the federal government, National Marine Fisheries Service, if we could see this figure, this is a representation of all of their different surveys that they have along the East Coast, running from Maine down to Florida. And some of the little dots in here represent where some of the wind farms are. And what they're saying is in parts of their surveys may be impacted, up to 80% of their kind of survey strata might be impacted by wind farms.
those surveys and the data that comes out of it directly puts into the input of traditional fisheries management. And when our surveys are kind of moved out, that starts to introduce uncertainties into the estimate that the scientific community would be providing guidance to the management agencies. When you have uncertainty in fisheries, that generally means more restrictive management. And so it's kind of a cascading effect. And so we have to understand what some of these cascading effects would be. You layer that on top of a climate change situation where the uncertainty of where species and resources are going over the next couple of generations are very, very much on the table. I try to tell our staff that, I now feel after 20 plus years, I'm one of those people, I remember when this used to happen on the coast. Those changes of my 20 years within the department, I'm fully expecting those changes to happen again within the next 5 years. Things are going really quickly. And so it is understandable that, we found ourselves being asked to work with the governor's energy office to help provide some guidance and suggestions for siting of a research array that was applied for last October. What we found was this uncertainty drives a lot of the impression of what's coming, and also drives a lot of the questions from the scientific community of how we can try to understand this, and to a certain degree, how we can minimize some of the potential impacts. So I'll try to walk you quickly through, I know we're limited on time, how we went through a process that took us from initially a 770 square mile area, large area of interest, down to a narrowed area of interest of 54 square miles, and ultimately a 16 square mile research lease that has been applied for. What we found as a department, while we were trying to minimize the impact, there is impact. There is no place in the Gulf of Maine. Deirdre's already showing you pictures, others have well. The fishing industry has adapted to work within the constraints that they have. And ultimately, depending on how some of these wind farms work through, they would prove to be another constraint that they're going to have to try to adapt to as well. Okay, so what we tried to use was we tried to gather in as much data as we could from different existing constraints, information that we had on our different commercial and recreational fisheries, kind of our federal management structure, and then some of what's going on in the environment, what's kind of some of the bathymetric bottom characteristics. And ultimately, what we tried to do is develop this intensity of use to help define what we didn't want to, as a department, define what the final site was. We wanted to say, given the constraints that we have, this is where we think we can minimize our impacts. So just some of the non-fishing constraints right out of the bat within the what was called the large area of interest, and just for those that may not have followed this process, what some of the constraints were was the inshore boundary being about 20 miles from shore, the offshore boundary being 40 miles from shore. Some additional constraints were around the shipping lanes in the southwest portion and the middle portion. And the red line, the red Y here, is a Department of Defense transit area as well. So right out of the bat, kind of the existing no-go constraints were significant. And so we were trying to continue to minimize the impacts in the remaining areas. What we found was some fisheries have a lot of data, other fisheries have very little data. They all lack the context to truly reflect how the fishing community is using this area. It's one thing to see a dot on the map. It's another thing to understand what that dot represents one of our subgroup meetings, Terry was talking with another fisherman and they were, Terry, you're going to have to remind me, but I think you were talking about, oh, it's the diamond toe. I think you were talking about. The diamond toe is because it was your father's boat that sank there. This name was Diamond. To me, that's not talking about, oh, what's the bottom characteristics and what are the fish in that toe. It's talking about what's the connection that Terry has to that area and what that means to him. And to me, that starts to get at how you look beyond the data into the connections that the fisheries have. We needed to get beyond just the straight up data. And so we felt that we needed to go into a kind of an interview-based process where, and again, this was a very controversial time. If you're living under a rock, you may have missed it, but the fishing industry is not very supportive of offshore wind. And it made our work a year and a half ago very difficult to move forward with. And that's very hard for an organization like the department that is based on collaborative work with the fishing industry. That is the basis of the work that we do. And so we had to dig deep to try to move forward as best we could under the circumstances we had. So what we tried to do was we used an interview to kind of augment what was the publicly available data. And ultimately, this is just a map of the actual numbers of interviews that we kind of scored for each 1 nautical mile. So just Platts Bank down here, really hot fishing spot, but it was also, as we talked to people, they had the most experience in Platts, where to the east, it's a very active lobster fishing area, but we had relatively fewer number of interviews. It's not a reflection on what the fishing intensity is in those areas. There are other ways to get there. So as an example of a data poor fishery, and species that I know and love, the lobster fishery, the best we can do for our spatial data, so where on the map our lobsters landed for a statewide basis, is looking at by zone, distance from shore, 0 to 3, 3 to 12, and 12 plus. That is a very big box to say, what is the fishing activity? You pick up a little bit of activity of higher landings in the Stonington area, as others were talking about, and maybe a little bit lower to the west and offshore. You really don't get much of a flavor for the spatial activity. As we went through our interview process and talking with fishermen, again, 20 miles offshore is a little bit further than we generally go with our sampling programs. We've been out there, but I wouldn't say that we know this as well as some of the inshore areas. We started to talk with fishermen and they started to reference all the area down to about 90 fathoms was really important for the lobster fishery. And so kind of taking the broad landings picture, more detail it around, say we want to avoid the areas in red and the areas in blue were fished less heavily by lobster fishery, allowed us to bring forward a map of the intensity of use by the lobster fishery within the large area of interest, from red being high intensity of use, so generally inshore, Platts Bank, and then lower intensity of use further offshore in these areas. Now, another area, let's call it data rich, the ground fishery. So in this fishery, each boat has to have a vessel monitoring system on board every 30 minutes, I believe it is. A ping goes up to a satellite and it records. So Big Brother is truly watching them everywhere they go. And depending on what kind of map you look at, you get a different impression of. So this is, again, one of these heat maps where in 2015 to 2016, you see one pattern of fishing activity. In 2011 to 2014, you see a very different pattern of fishing activity. This is some of the information that we needed to provide context to. And as we went through our interview process, we found the high intensity areas being around Platts Bank, what's called the Wilkinson Toe. And this is actually a fishing closure, the Western Gulf of Maine area. and a little bit more activity around Toothaker Ridge. So we averaged across all the different fisheries, I think we did 7 or 8 different fisheries to come up with an overall intensity of fishing, with Platts Bank and Jeffries being high, some relatively low intensity areas in the middle. And then ultimately, this is the narrowed area of interest that the department put forward as potential areas. So the area of interest did not eliminate, it did minimize we tried to minimize the impact, but we did not eliminate it. There are some fisheries that are impacted more than others. In this case, for the narrowed area interest, the ground fish fishery is probably would be more impacted than the lobster fishery. And it's largely because it's the depth and the habitat that was being recommended as a constraint for some of the development conversations. So again, specifically, lunch was impacted, dabs and witch founder as well. So some of our conclusions, all areas within a 770-mile area had fishing activity. We were able to populate that with direct experience on all of our interviews or publicly available data that was looked at. We attempted to minimize conflict within the criteria. The preferred anchoring and habitat does impact or potentially could impact different habitats, species, and gear types. Trawl gear activity, so specifically ground fishermen might be impacted the most just by how they would potentially move around some of the structures. And again, what's really interesting in the areas that were recognized as having kind of a low intensity of use, this actually had a really nice synergy with the wildlife concerns and conversations at the same time. Something Wing and I have talked about, and I think this really speaks to some of the ecosystem linkages, that an area that is really interesting for fishing also has an interest around wildlife. I think we were able to kind of minimize some of that with the selection of the narrowed area of interest. But if we are thinking about larger sites, what some of the take-home messages that we learned from this exercise that we did. So we're starting to think about what would this mean for larger programs outside of just a research array discussion. So our preferred site ultimately within the large area of interest, which was, so this is what went into BOEM for their application. What we really found was this area is a transitional area, whether it be for species and related fisheries. So further inshore, the absence of data here is lobster fishing. Ground fish develops as you go further offshore. And so you have this kind of changing of communities. And if we learned anything from Ed Munsey down at the harbor today, is that the decision to go offshore is a significant decision for lobster fishing. It's a significant investment, commitment of time, and safety as well, because they're going a heck of a long way. So ultimately, this transition kind of has led to some of the research questions that we have. And so I want to pick up at the first slide when I started talking was saying there are legitimate questions about the ecosystem impacts, the fisheries impact, and the economic impact. And so we want to try to do, if the research array is supported, we want to go through the idea of sampling along gradient. So this would be the location of the research array. And essentially, we want to go from an area of low intensity where the array was sited to an area of higher intensity of use of fisheries or wildlife, and be able to understand the impact. So if you add structures to this area, what does that do to the species and habitat, as well as the fisheries to that? So also have questions around coexistence and transmission, impacts, direct and impact on fishing, potential displacement, potential lost and derelict fishing gear. As soon as that fishing gear may get entangled and left on some of the anchors for the structures, now you have a potential secondary entanglement risks for some protected resources that is, there's a lot of effort going into whales right now. When we look at some of the EMF concerns around cabling, and then also habitat impacts as well. So applications to the larger Gulf of Maine process. So lobsters remains a data poor fishery as far as spatial footprint. There is a move to 100% reporting and trackers in the near future. It's going to be too late for the larger Gulf of Maine conversation. There's insufficient time and resources to provide necessary context for broader areas. We can't do what was done for the research array for the entire Gulf of Maine. We just don't have the resources to put towards that. And so we're going to have to move forward in some ways that try to minimize it. Maybe we can pick up some of the themes that we did, and I'm sure others will as well. Every area has a history. The example I have of, I talked about with Terry and that location to the toe. There's a story to be told everywhere that fishing happens. And that's one thing that I think felt in some ways, and as we went through the siting processes, that the department learned a lot about this area that we didn't know. And it really took those conversations with the fishing industry. So the main research array represents a relatively low use area. It's only 16 square miles. A commercial array, let's say approximately 150 square miles, will have increased conflict with existing users and wildlife. We will not be able to thread the needle with a large commercial site. In some ways, I think that we were able to do that in the siting of the research array. We were trying to make the best out of a bad situation or a difficult situation. I think when it comes to the size of a commercial array, there's going to be direct and significant impacts on existing users and potentially wildlife and potentially the ecosystem. I think that's where we're at.
So, Carl and Deirdre, thank you so much both for that. This is an opportunity for the advisory committee to sort of chew on this for a second, right? We don't need to go over again the research array siting, but that is an example of how to think what will happen as Maine and the other states consider how to deconflict areas in the Gulf of Maine, right? And the future that's coming, at least the way the BOEM process is set up. So questions for DMR, for others about sort of what's going on out there right now and what that means for the work ahead? Thoughts for what needs to happen? Terry?
Terry Alexander. So I don't know if the question's for Carla or Deirdre. Have you looked at what the impact is going to be? Because, the folks that fish in the right whale area, October to January, is it, that it's closed? That's huge. That's huge. That's a huge revenue source for them at that time of the year. So have you looked at how many people will be impacted in zone C and D? Is that right? Mostly where that thing is, and how much of a smaller box they'll have to work in and displace other fishermen from that spot. Have you looked at that stuff yet? And on the survey, another quick question, real easy. Have you been working on what the impacts for trawl surveys will be with these arrays attracting fish fish that we can't get access to, that they're trying to survey. And we're setting quotas based on artificial numbers that are going to cause economic impact to the fishery because it'll be lower quotas when all the fish are hanging around the research array and we can't get access to them. Have you looked into that yet, or is that something in the future?
I can try. First, the lobster question, as far as the closed area. I mean, this is one of the problems when we have a data poor fishery, is that we don't have the metrics to track that accurately. I know others we're trying to do different surveys. There's obviously direct conversations that are going on, but without reporting requirements right now, it makes it very hard to quantify exactly what those impacts are. So our Marine Patrol, took some trips down into the closed area. They're quantifying it. I know other people are talking to impacted fishermen, but it's difficult, and it's hard for the department to make the case for the lobster fishery on the impact when we don't have that data to bring forward. First and foremost, second question was around fish aggregation around these structures. It's certainly the case in Gulf of Mexico, and there's a huge debate around red snapper. I don't pretend to know much about it at all, other than the surveys can't get into the areas where the red snapper are. And so you have a really horrible conversation of there's red snapper, there's no red snapper, there's red snapper, there's no red snapper. And I'm sure that's kind of being set up in some way. So some of our attempts of thinking through some of the research questions that are out there is to try to develop methodologies that could answer some of those questions of what fish are there. And then also, how can we fish around these structures as well? How can you fish around them? And what are some areas that maybe we could explore where you're not on the hook for losing gear or taking that risk? We do it as a part of an experiment.
Thanks. Okay. Other reactions, Will?
Yeah, I think more just a reaction, and as a huge admirer of the work that the DMR does, thinking through the timelines presented, thinking through the research array, and then the time gaps between that and then the development of commercial wind, if that happens in the Gulf of Maine. I think just recognizing that there are representatives from the federal delegation here, thinking about how revenue sharing can be, how the states can get more money to fund more people at DMR, to do more with this data, to make sure that as wind is being sited in the Gulf of Maine, that it's the best, and the full effort is being brought to bear, and that the Department of Resources and others have all the resources they need. So just a plug for the delegation and those folks, that I think revenue sharing is a conversation that's still pretty young in Maine and what we're thinking about. But after that New York sale, I think it'd be great to get some of that money flowing to Maine and make sure that people are resourced. Yeah, I think just quite simply the notion that if there is a lease sale in the Gulf of Maine, that some portion of that money be going to the states that are directly affected by that lease sale. As of right now, I think it goes directly to Treasury, as opposed to, and I know BOEM wants a piece of that too. Understandably, $1 billion+ is a nice chunk of change, but I think that the states need to be getting some of that money.
Yeah, the easy pass. If there's going to be revenue sharing, the state's going to get some money. I think the affected fishing community should be involved in that revenue sharing as well.
This is maybe a comment, but also a Carl and Deirdre question. I think, part of Maine's approach to this research array is we actually don't understand it. And now I think what you've illustrated is like, we can work really hard and it's hard to get the data. We made our best effort and we came up with a location that we thought would have the least impacts for this pretty small research. Now we are also, the federal government is probably certainly moving faster than the governor. And, we are focused on this research array because we want to actually build it and see what happens. BOEM is working on a much more advanced process to think about sites in the Gulf of Maine. So I think that Carl, you probably put it into pretty good context, but I'm just wondering, we saw this 3-state meeting, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Maine, all kinds of federal agencies there. I didn't hear all of the NOAA fishery comments, but just what are how does the state of Maine work with NOAA fisheries? And what do you think NOAA fisheries approach is going to be to the kinds of data challenges we have when it comes to other sites?
So are we talking pre-sighting or pre-construction or post-construction? Pre.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, they're gonna use whatever information they have. What we found was that if you're looking at larger scale and some of the federal data that's available, you get a fairly good picture. So we queried the federal database for fisheries impact in the large area of interest, and we got communities that were impacted, value of the fisheries, what species were impacted. As we started to narrow our questions down, the data limits were really apparent, and it became to be, you really had to hold your nose to go forward with some of the data. And I think that's what Terry was talking to earlier today. So there's constraints on where the data can take you. And I would say that on the size of commercial leases, there's going to be significant impacts, and you're going to have, one of the preferred fishing areas is going to be impacted, wherever that might be, and the process is going to have to work through how that goes forward. I don't know if Deirdre and Meredith, if you'd had any other.
Okay. We definitely want to take a break because we've been sitting here for a little while now. If there's one last thought on thinking about these presentations, folks from the advisory committee want to raise up. Okay. So as I mentioned before, we're taking kind of a longish break for about a half hour. Why don't we be back, 10 past? And the reason we're taking a longish break is because we actually want you to talk with each other. And we want folks who are joining us, members of the public here, also to feel like we can talk with each other more informally about this stuff. And so we want to take a half hour. We also have coffee. I can see it getting set up right now. And I saw some cookies, yes, and some famous cupcakes that apparently are very worth trying. But the intent for the next half hour is to have this be a little bit more informal, and folks can talk with each other and ask questions of each other and reflect on these conversations. All right, so let's convene back as a advisory committee in a half hour, 10 past. In the meantime, grab a cupcake, have a conversation. Thanks, everybody. And Samanish, you can pause the webinar.
Okay.
You can help me with the crowd in the kitchen. Thanks. You can help the crowd in the kitchen, maybe move that conversation outside if they want to. Okay, so there's only one more thing we need to do today together in this meeting. And that thing is, we want to just have some shared reflection about what we're hearing and what it means for our work among the advisory committee here. A lot's been said today. We had significant presentations. We felt it down on the wharf today earlier, which was great. And so we just want to reflect, knowing that we're moving forward with our advisory committee work. We'll be getting together in person in July to review the sort of final submissions from the working groups around their recommendations. And the roadmap is going to really start to take shape. So I just open it up, and Laura can note some things down. I pulled this out of my closet. It had like my kids' scratchings on it and stuff. I haven't had a flip chart in a long time, but let's try it. What are we thinking, having sat the last several hours in this conversation, the informal conversation, the formal presentations? What do we want to make sure together we process and together we take away from this conversation? I leave it wide open. Initial reflections, things people want to say. Let me give you a mic, Grunk.
I'd like to say, for starters, I'd like to thank all the presenters today, including what we began with this morning, superb. And then Dawn and Carla and Deidre and Carl, superb presentations today. And I think that listening to the presentations this afternoon and what combined with what we learned this morning, there's a lot of science here, and that's really important, and that's going to help steer us and inform us and help us with our recommendations. But I think equally, there's a lot of texture and nuance to it that doesn't come out in science. Social fabric, social cohesion of these communities, and what have you, that's equally important. And I think this meeting has in some ways really brought that to light in ways that make sure that we don't ignore that aspect of it as we find ways to make sure that this industry, which is one of the largest in the state of Maine, but in terms of fishing industry, the largest in our nation, and the way of life and the culture that comes from that and has grown out of that, will be able to continue for generations going forward. And so how we shape our recommendations and do it in ways that we do our absolute best to take that into account and do the kinds of things that will help this generation of fishermen. And I say we have two generations here, your generation, Terry, nothing against you, but I think there's some younger, the next generation behind you and their young children who will be the succeeding generation, that we can pass it on to all of them in ways that will continue to serve us as it has ever since this place was settled. So I think that was one of the big takeaways for me, is to gain I knew it, but this was a way to stare it in the face and see it and feel it. And I really appreciate all of you who made that possible today.
Thanks, Grog. Thanks so much. Other reflections, things that, sorry, let me go to Ben. If you can introduce yourselves to them.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Ben Lucas from the Maine State Chamber of Commerce. Just a couple thoughts from today. Kind of piggybacking off what Grog said, I think it's important to continue to engage with the fishing community. We at the State Chamber have kind of taken some initiatives of our own, working with Patrice. Obviously, as an organization, we are supportive of offshore wind, and we have been for a number of years now, but it's continued to engage and hear from the fishing community. For me personally, it's been very, very eye-opening. And just one example today, we were talking when we were with Matt about the connecting infrastructure and where we're going to bring these cables and if they're going to be floating, or, it's like you have the perception almost that it's just the physical, turbines being in the water. And that's not necessarily the case. Like, there are more concerns about it. So for me anyway, that was an eye-opening thing. And I think, the conversation of where we're going to connect this, if it's going to be, Portland, the Booth Bay area, Wiscasset, where the infrastructure exists to be able to connect the power that might be generated, and how that's going to also impact the fishing community, not just the physical locations of where we site the projects. So just a couple of my thoughts.
Yeah. Thanks, man. Other reactions, thoughts, folks, things that people want to say? Commissioner.
Thank you. First, I want to thank the advisory committee because the work that you're doing is really important. Terry Alexander made a point earlier about loss of control when this goes to BOEM and this goes to Washington. But it's critically important that whatever happens through this committee, that it's done very thoughtfully with really good vision. The one word and term that I did not hear at all today was certainty. The commercial fishing industry in the state of Maine has always had a lack of certainty, but it ebbs and flows like the tide from a management perspective, right? We go through a management process, we get a little bit of certainty back, they adapt, they move on, and we continue to fish. Here we have so many variables facing the commercial fishing industry. This is just one more really big one. So as you're thinking about the future and how you're going to think about changes here within the Gulf of Maine, certainty should be part of those variables. How can we start to narrow down uncertainty for the future of the industry? So thank you.
Thanks. Advisory committee members, other things that stuck with you today that you want to share? Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. It was certainly useful to get some of the insights and the particularized concerns. One thing struck me was there's a lot of missing information that would be very helpful to have. And in particular, some of the detailed information about lobster intensive zones out there, which even if they don't play a part in what Maine can directly affect, may be very useful to bring into the federal discussion, even after the leases are granted, to help guide particular placement if it comes to that. And coupled with that is the need to continue to try to overcome the resistance from the fishing community to give information to people they don't trust, i.e. everybody in government like me. And that's going to be a challenge, because I think the fishing community, like the farming community in which I grew up for a portion of my life, is sort of constitutionally independent and, wants to be left to its own devices. And therefore, I think there's sort of an inherent difficulty in addressing bureaucratic structures and finding arguments that are effective with bureaucratic structures, sort of getting past the mutual insult stage. So I think those are the, getting the right information, finding the right path to getting the right information, and then finding a way to make use of it in fora in which we may not actually have direct impact are all going to be very important.
Other thoughts, Steve?
My name is Steve Von Vogt. I co-chair the road mapping from the supply chain perspective, and I represent a wide and diverse supply chain in this state that has worked in both the marine industry, the fishing industry. We work in all of those areas. I know that Maine has a number of competitive advantages. We should be taking full advantage of those. We also have areas in which we're at a disadvantage, and we're at a disadvantage even in New England in terms of our position and ability to control things. So we should, I think the most powerful thing we can do is talk together and figure out where we have advantage and we have leverage and use it to advance the economy in the state and to advance the future for our kids.
Other reflections, Dan?
Dan Burgess from the Energy Office. I'm really appreciative and taken by the spirit of engagement today and the willingness to have this here and to work together in that fashion. I think is really important, and I think maybe it's not a hallmark of being in Maine, but it certainly feels that way. And I just really appreciate that spirit, and hopefully we can continue to have that going forward. And we're going to go through this BOEM process. This is the roadmap process to inform future work. There's just a lot swirling, and to Commissioner's point around uncertainty, I think the more that this engagement and open door can happen among all of us will be better for it. And I've been trying to think about it in a way of there are these kind of larger macro issues at play, but then also many of the they're not micro, but components within that, right? So we're talking about, what Matt talked about with EMF and transmission, can we get additional analysis and studies of that, or looking at peer review to look at that? We talked, on Ed's boat today, talked about the difficulty of moving gear when someone needs to do a survey and the timing of that. So those aren't micro issues, but they all impact. And I think if we can, kind of continue to have that open line of communication engagement, I think we'll be better for it.
Laura's been taking notes on this, and I think it's helpful. We can walk through a little bit, make sure we're capturing this. These are really important reflections that let's keep with us as we meet in next month and beyond. Anything else? Meredith, do you want to say?
Thanks. Just a couple things I wanted to, we're always talking about the need for better information, particularly in the lobster fishery. And as a fishery manager, I think the department's been making a case for that for a long time for a lot of reasons. And this is one of them, that it would help to demonstrate where the footprint of the fishery is. But I also think that it's important in this context to recognize that the fishing industry feels very differently about that kind of big brother approach of being monitored and having to report. It's very different from how the rest of us do our jobs. And I think it's just important to recognize that distinction from a sensitivity and cultural standpoint, interacting with people. This is a lot to ask. The other thing that I wanted to just sort of emphasize again is that, the process that we went through with the research array was substantial and time consuming. And as Carl said, we're not going to be able to do that kind of level of work in the Gulf of Maine wide task force process. But even more to the point, I think, despite the extensive effort that we all feel we went to try to have that conversation and engage with the industry in a meaningful way, I don't think the industry felt that was that meaningful. I don't think they felt like they were that closely contacted. I don't feel like they think that this was a great process. So I think we just have to reflect on that as well, that the process we think was better than, what we could likely see in the federal arena is still not good enough, perhaps, from the perspective of a lot of people that we're talking to. And so just, again, context for how we're engaging with people.
Let me go to Don. I've got a
Yeah. Early in the process and in the federal process, the economics with the fishing industry, I think, kind of starts from the point of view of a discussion about compensation. And I think we've heard over the past several months that that's not what the fishing industry is interested in. And I think the question of which I'm just repeating myself earlier in the afternoon, that to the degree we can shift the focus to one of investment, I think that's a door where there may be some shared interest. And so I would just encourage everybody in our working groups, as we're going forward over the next 2-3 months, the rubber kind of starts to meet the road in July. And I think to pay some attention to the investment question would be smart for all of us.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Suzanne McDonald from the Island Institute. So sort of builds on some similar themes. I guess I was talking to Stephanie and I feel like my brain is going, but I work for an organization that believes really strongly in sort of community-based solutions and community-led sort of visions. And I feel like the coast of Maine, the state of Maine, is one big community. We're not that big, right? And part of me, I always feel empowered and inspired by working with communities at that level, because I do believe there's a lot of creativity and innovation that can kind of come from thinking outside the box and hearing from folks about what they think is a different way to solve a problem. And I guess what I'm struck by in this sort of broader macro process is how much can we feel like the process, the path forward, the roadmap forward is really able to reflect the realities of the coast of Maine, of the state of Maine. How can we feel like we're putting something together that is like just has these fingerprints of Maine imprinted on it, that we can feel comfortable about the path forward being somewhat different than maybe what it is in other states, because we have talked today about how there's a lot that is different. And from a developer perspective, I'm not a developer, but so I guess what I'm seeking to understand is, in the goal to develop offshore wind, we don't as a state want to shut down that opportunity. So I guess what I'm keen to understand moving forward is how comfortable can we feel to be creative and maybe outside of the box and sort of Maine specific and reactive to what we're learning about here in Maine, versus when does sort of taking a different approach or sort of just defining the path forward in different ways puts Maine at a disadvantage. Because I think what I hear is like, oh, well, if we go too far out of the box, if we're too restrictive, or if we put too many expectations in place, people won't want to come here. I actually feel like that potentially is the strength of what we all can do together, is to say, we've already done a lot of this work. We can anticipate where some of the issues are, and we're sort of setting a path forward that responds to that that we've learned, and that we think that's an asset to what we're doing. So I guess I just look for folks to kind of help us understand, how far can we go to kind of do this the Maine way? And when do we need to be cognizant of that potentially having an impact on future development off the coast of Maine?
Will Sedlak again, Maine Conservation Voters. I think just in reflecting on what Meredith was saying, I think there's this moment here. I mean, I'm sitting right now between the Labor and the Chamber of Commerce, and that's not a group that's often in the same room, let alone in the same corner of a room together. And that's pretty amazing. And I think there is something to be said for the power of a state government, a federal government, of a government larger than an individual to bring people together. And I think that's what I've really enjoyed so far about this roadmap process. And I think the more that we can, I hear so much, part of my work is also involved working on voting rights and election administration. And I hear so much that people don't trust the government, they don't trust their neighbor, they don't trust their town clerk, any of the above. And I think the more that we can spend time together in processes like these, hearing from each other, I think the more trust that we can build. And I think just so appreciative that the state applied for this money, the federal government gave us this money to do this work, and that everybody here has been working on this, because this isn't something that just happens. These aren't just groups of people that get together and decide to hang out. So I think that's just what we can do after the roadmap is completed. I think is something that I'm really mindful of, and how we bring this work moving forward, so that we're talking not just to fishermen, but to every constituent up and down the coast and in the interior of Maine. So just kind of reflections after today.
I'm just going to second something that Suzanne said, is that the Maine way involves some things that we uniquely know how to do here well. We have companies in the state like Chinbro and Reed that erect most of the land-based turbines, at least in the eastern half of the country. We have environmental permitting firms that do work globally in this space all over the world. We have unique ability to work on the water and do things to the extent that we can reach out, and this is only done through dialogue, because we can't figure it out. If I don't know what you're doing and you don't know what I'm doing, nothing's going to happen. And so part of the role of this group should be to reach out in this way and figure out where those opportunities are and capitalize on them. It doesn't do us any good if we don't capitalize on them. And that's the only way we will affect or steer the BOEM process, is through our competitive advantages. Right now, the chief engineers at Mayflower Wind are all Mainers, they're all Maine graduates, they're all from these companies. We have influence, let's use it and identify it and use it.
Thanks, Steve. Okay. Is there anything else? Where'd I go?
Back of the back, Matt.
Okay, great. So there's folks okay taking a few moments to talk? Let's do this.
I just want to thank everyone for taking time out of your day to actually come down and talk to fishermen. I've been to most of your meetings via Zoom and stuff. And this is actually the first time that I've actually felt like you've listened and actually paid attention to some of the stuff that fishermen have to say. And I hope that meetings like this continue in person, maybe at some other fishing communities, because we all catch the same critter, but we're all the communities are very different in how they operate and how they fish and everything like that. So I think there is a lot to be learned. If I know you guys are busy and you're on a time crunch, but if you actually get out, hold these meetings in person and meet some of the fishermen, we're pretty nice, easygoing people that are just trying to make a living. I think you'd learn that and I am appreciative of you taking your time to do that today. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. And you want to protect the ocean. That's what I heard you say. Yeah. Yeah. I saw a hand back here. Was there a comment you wanted to make? Yeah. Okay.
I just wanted to follow up, and I think it was already spoken, this gentleman right here. I think one of the biggest issues that I see is the trust issue. You know, if I jump on Mr. Alexander's boat, I trust him with my life. You know what I mean? I trust him to provide a paycheck, you know. With the uncertainty that the commissioner spoke about, you know, and that trust also goes both ways from the information the fishermen provide so we can all work together. And it also like, I've had numerous meetings with the commissioner, and we have a trust with each other. You know what I mean? That when we sit down, we're honest and we're straight up with each other, and I think that is one of the areas that, the risk versus the reward, it's not only a livelihood, Mr. Alexander, myself and Matt, this is a heritage, you know what I mean? This is hundreds of years, to this state that, and some of it direct of our families, and this windmill will, the windmill with the whale closure that we're dealing with, me personally, both of those direct, immediately, I mean, I'm one person that has a direct impact by both of these, whether it be transiting through the windmills or, navigating, to the closed area. But I think the trust, and then the, what is the reward of all of this? You know what I mean? And who's going to benefit? Is the consumer going to benefit from the windmills? Is the state going to benefit from the windmills? And, and I think those are all, uncertainties, you know what I mean? Which makes it hard as a fisherman to really, get on board with supporting the windmills. You know what I mean? It's as it's been spoken many times, it's not about the money. It's really not. It's or getting, handouts or kickbacks. A lot of us just want to go and earn our living like we have and like we've been taught and trained for, 40 years of my life, so anyways, that's I think trust is a big thing. Oh yeah, sorry. My name's Corey Hawks, by the way. So.
Thanks, Corey.
Yeah.
Yeah, appreciate that. Okay, great. Other thoughts we want to say before we wrap up today? We've said a lot, right? We've said a lot. We've talked about being mindful of the social fabric and the way of life. We've talked about continuing to engage. We're talking about there's a range of impacts out there and we're learning about those together. There's probably studies and things we can do to learn more together, right? We're talking about a lot of different things that you've just said. We commit to writing this up and making sure this is part of what's memorialized from this meeting. At least we'll have some of these takeaways so we don't forget. It's so hard to keep everything in your head. So that's our commitment, is to get this written up. Anything else from folks before we finish up today? Grog? And Patrice? Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry, Patrice.
No, go ahead. Ladies first. Chivalry lives on. I'm Patrice McCarron with the Maine Lobstermen's Association. I just wanted to follow up with Matt and Corey's comments and thank everybody for coming and for coming with an open mind and an open heart. And I couldn't agree with Matt more that I feel that for the first time we've been heard. I really thank the organizers for bringing in presenters who are not active fishermen. I feel like the fishing community has been viewed as an obstacle, as a NIMBY person, as kind of a royal pain in the butt. And to see, the state and the Gulf of Maine Research Institute and Carla stand up and really show that we have legitimate concerns, legitimize those, and to have you all actually hear them for what they are, it starts to bridge us towards where Corey is. Maybe we could establish some trust and have a place to work from. But when you feel like you're just kind of the pain in the butt and you're the obstacle and your concerns that you're passionate about aren't being heard, it's just hard to take the next step. And I'm just a little mushy after seeing everybody in person today, but I feel proud to be part of this fishing community. And the fishing community has a soul. And I think that today you all opened yourselves up to feel a little bit of that. And it's almost indescribable where the fear and the emotion comes from, but it's just this sense of, I don't know, like the potential for this massive collective loss. And so I just thank you all for being present and hearing us. And I feel more encouraged. I wouldn't say I'm optimistic about offshore wind. I'm not quite there yet, but I feel like we have a much better space to work together. So thank you.
Applause that.
Well, that's a nice way to end up, Patrice. Thank you. And I think I know what you mean by soul. I grew up in Aroostook County, so I'm very proud of being from D County. And now I live in Cundy's Harbor, and I'm not a fisherman, but I'm very damn proud of being from Cundy's Harbor and what it's all about. And it has a soul. And the county had a soul, and the state of Maine has a soul. And when I was in the Navy, I traveled all over the world and went everywhere, and I was proud to be from America. And that has a soul. And so we had a lot of soul food here today. I think it really got us amped up, and it's not so bad to get amped up with a little bit of soul and a little bit of passion. So I think it's just been a remarkable day. I do want to call out very specifically, and I may have some of the names mixed up, but I'll start with Terry. And of course, we had Ed Muncy and Matt, who's still here, Matt Gilly, and Forrest Moody, and Steve Davis, and Corey Hawks, and anybody that is part of the fishing community. Thank you for being here. You gave us a big part of your life this afternoon, and I really appreciate it. And you added immeasurably to it. And we have many more meetings. All of them are in the public domain. You can listen in and grade us on how well we listen to you and that we take your message forward. And so in that spirit, I want to end with, on Monday, the 27th of June, all of you on the advisory committee please put that down. I think it's going to be about an hour and a half, and I think that's going to be by Zoom, right? And then the next in-person is going to be on Wednesday, the 20th of July. That'll probably be a fairly long meeting, and it may be up at the University of Maine. It still hasn't been decided, but at least put them as placeholders on your calendar. And with that.
Well said. Well said. Yeah, no. Any next steps?
Yeah, I think that's it. Let's, thank you, everybody. I just want to second everybody's thanks. We should clap. One more comment. Hang on.
I just want to say, again, being a fisherman, I really appreciate you guys being here. This means a lot. This is more than you know. It's hard to describe what it actually means to a fisherman when this is being put on you. I was 9 when I started fishing on my own. I worked on other boats before that. I'm 36. I've been doing this my entire life. I don't know anything else. Well, I take that back. I actually did go away to school for 3 years. I got my degree in computer animation. Learned something. I have a trade that is very sought after, but it's in my blood. It drove me bonkers being away at school. Like, the ocean was calling me the entire time I was gone. And I came back here to do this, and I will do this. And what I think that it isn't, fishermen, it's hard for people to get up and tell you how they feel. The guys that, there's hundreds of guys that want to be here today. They're not here today because they don't want to be. They're not here today because they're standing in their yards working on gear or working on their boat, painting buoys or hauling traps. It's not because they don't want to be here today. Like, that's what's important for you guys to understand. Like, Maine is built of people who work. They work for what they have. And so that's important. And it's important for us that you guys know that. And so what I will say is that I'll give my information to Terry. If there's ever any questions whatsoever, I'm an open book. There's lots of us. I can put you in contact with other people who are an open book that will give you all of the information that you could ever even dream of. If you want to go out on a boat for a day and actually see what we're doing, just ask, because we'll show you. We have no issues with that. Like, it's what we are. I would rather you take my leg away than take my livelihood away. Like, that's not a joke. And so, again, I appreciate you guys being here and doing this. So thank you.
Thank you. with that, I think we should end because that's the sentiment. And so thanks everybody for doing this. We'll see you later in subsequent meetings. There is work to be done. Thanks. That's all I have to say. So take care. Appreciate your help. Thank you.